All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first session in the Let's Talk Housing, Creating a More Affordable Future webinar series for San Mateo County. I'm Christy Wong. I'm with Baird and Driscoll. We've worked with all the jurisdictions in San Mateo County for more than a decade on housing policy, including the current housing element update and Let's Talk Housing outreach effort. So before I walk through our agenda, we want to make a few announcements in a few different languages to give directions to anyone who wants interpretation. So we have interpreters available to interpret in Spanish, Mandarin, and Cantonese. And you can use the channels through the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. Daisy, could you help with Spanish?
Uh-huh. Hola, buenas noches a todos. Gracias por estar aquí. Si quisiera usar la interpretación en español que está disponible esta noche, al fondo de su pantalla encontrará un icono que parece un globito. Haga clic ahí y seleccione español. También, si quiere estar en un cuarto para platicar luego en español, por favor, envíenme un mensaje a Daisy, me llamo Daisy, y dígame que quiere platicar con otras personas en español y yo lo pondré en un cuarto en español. Gracias. I'm done.
Thank you. Josh, do you want to play the recordings for the Cantonese and Mandarin?
Yeah, I'll do one. Paul will do the other.
Okay.
Oh,
Let's do that
sorry.
again.
Yeah, let me do that again.
你好，呢度係講廣東話嘅。如果你聽廣東話咧，你撳嗰個標誌啦，希望你可以明白同埋聽到啦。
Okay.
Doris is the Cantonese interpreter, and Celia is the Mandarin interpreter.
Paul, do you want to do the last language?
请点击普通话翻译按钮。
And Lala will be the interpreter in the Spanish channel. I think Daisy said that. So thanks to all of our interpreters and for all the help we're having today. So what are we doing today? Let's Talk Housing is an outreach effort of all the cities, towns, and the county in San Mateo County. We're trying to increase awareness of and participation in the housing element process, which is currently underway. And our goal is to make sure everyone is shaping our shared future. So today we want to help residents and stakeholders gain a grounding in why housing affordability matters. We have a couple of speakers who will talk about how it impacts San Mateo County residents, workers, and employees, and then we'll learn a little bit more from Shane Phillips at UCLA. Did someone want to say something? And then we'll close with some small group reflections and point you to some resources. So first we're going to start by hearing from Belen Seara and Nevada Merriman. Belen currently oversees the efforts of the county's health policy and planning program. She has over 10 years of experience promoting equity through multi-sectoral partnerships, community-based research, policy advocacy, community organizing, nonprofit management, and leadership development. And she is going to talk to us about why affordability matters from a public health perspective. Belen?
Wonderful. I thought it was a small group before that, but I'm ready to share my screen. Let me see if you can see it. Can you guys hear me well, Christy? Can you give me the thumbs up? Yep, good. And you can see the presentation. So I'm Belen Seara. I'm the acting manager of Health Policy and Planning Program, and we are the unit within San Mateo County Health and that addresses what we call the social determinants of health, those conditions, social, environmental conditions that set us for success in life and having a good quality life. So today I just wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of the connection between health and housing. And for us, when we look at health, we look at just the clinical and the non-clinical interventions that determine someone's health outcomes. And when it comes to health outcomes, our zip codes are the ones that determine most of our health outcomes. So where we live has a tremendous impact on long-term health outcomes. Housing is primarily one of the key drivers of health, and the pandemic made that very clear when we needed a place, a safe and a place to shelter in place. So when we, here in San Mateo County, as many of you know, healthy places that have what we call healthy places are those places that make healthy choices the easy choice, meaning that we can have access to, grocery stores and walking and biking, active lifestyles that are accessible to all of us, having that opportunity to live in a healthy place. It's not distributed equally in San Mateo County. So not only that, is that when we start seeing that healthy amenities like affordable housing and public transportation and biking and walking options are coming to neighborhoods, those neighborhoods become more expensive, gentrified, and then those residents get displaced, and that has also negative health outcomes. So one of the projects that we started working on a few years ago with UC Berkeley is to really understand how this lack of affordability in San Mateo County was impacting local residents. So UC Berkeley in 2017 interviewed 100 families in San Mateo County that have been displaced or and evicted from their residencies. And what we learned from that, those interviews, is that the lack of housing options are leading folks to have significant trade-off, moving into overcrowded situations or accepting substandard housing conditions, being displaced from their community within the county or outside the county, or becoming homeless for quite a while. We also learned that displacement of these families are leading to longer commutes, school disruptions for their kids, and less access to opportunities to healthy choices and environments. So what we learned was that 1 out of the 3 families, kids that have been displaced out of these 100 interviews, the kids had to move to different school districts. And then we also learned that those displaced families moved to neighborhoods and communities that had what we call less safe environmental conditions. So increased air pollution, less access to healthcare facilities, and less access to other amenities that make a healthy place. And we also documented that those families that were displaced, they experience increased trauma. So the health impacts of not having an affordable, accessible housing option impacted their immediate health, at least. What we noticed also with the pandemic is that overcrowding was one of the drivers of infections in San Mateo County. And what we are seeing here in this chart is that when we look at overcrowding by race, many of our communities of color experience higher overcrowding rates than our white residents. And we noticed that with the percentage of cases of COVID infections, primarily in the Hispanic community. So we couldn't do a control study to really determine the drivers of infections, but our health officer on July 2020 released one of the statements that basically said the higher infection rates, primarily in our Latino community, were because of overcrowded, multi-generational situation households, and also because they make up the majority of our essential workforce. So we know that housing, when folks don't have access to safe, affordable housing options, they are more likely to be susceptible to infectious diseases. So for us, within health policy and planning team, we have been promoting the 5P solutions frameworks through our BARHI coalition, the Public Health Coalition of the Bay Area. The 5Ps meaning production, protections, preservation, location, place, and power building, making sure that impacted communities inform policies. We are engaged around habitability without displacement issues. We provide a health equity lens to the Home for All initiative. We have been participating in the equity advisory group, Let's Talk House in San Mateo County, that 21 Elements is leading. And we are engaged in healthy and resilient home initiatives around the county. And we continue to expand our understanding and research around eviction and health literature. So with that, I'm happy to pass it on to the next.
Thank you so much, Belen.
And Christy, can I make a quick announcement? The interpreters just wanted me to remind the speakers to speak slowly and clearly if they can, to make it easier, as easy as possible to do that simultaneous interpretation, which is of course very hard. All right, thanks.
Next, we're going to have Nevada Merriman from Mid-Penn Housing. She is the Director of Policy for one of Northern California's largest and most experienced nonprofit developers of high-quality affordable housing. She has been with Mid-Penn since 2007 and also serves on the board of the Housing Leadership Council. Sorry about that, Celia. So, hey, Nevada, I want to turn it over to you to talk about why housing affordability matters to employers, to workers, and families.
Thank you. So Mid-Penn was founded in 1970 out of a Stanford University concern about the very high cost of housing here on the San Francisco Peninsula. So for the last 50 years, we've been worried about this topic and working on this topic. Our mission is to provide safe, affordable housing of high quality to those in need. And that's because everybody deserves a safe and stable, affordable place to call home. We work on improving housing affordability by creating subsidized housing, and that's just one tool to create stability and access to our communities. There are many other tools as well, including land use reforms and policies designed to create choices for people across the income spectrum. So affordability is important because when an individual or family is cost burdened by housing, they have to make really tough choices. They may have to decide whether to pay for food or medicine or juggle expenses with maintaining their shelter. And thank you, Belen, for sharing what that meant for people during a pandemic. What we saw was that residents continued to pay their rent because the idea of being homeless during a pandemic was just untenable, but they did so at the expense of other important family expenses. So at Mid-Penn, we had a 5x increase in individuals that were requesting food assistance, for instance, which really was kind of an on-the-ground metric for seeing what kind of decisions people were making every week. Now, we say that somebody is cost burdened when a household pays more than 30% of income towards housing. And I know we've been we have become accustomed to that in the Bay Area as being normal. But what is really noteworthy is that we have many households that are actually paying more than half of their income, and we call this severe cost burden. In California, there's 1 in 5 households that face this. And in San Mateo County, we know that 72% of extremely low income households pay more than half of their income on housing. As you move up the income spectrum, as an individual or a family, this lets up a little bit. For very low income individuals and families, it's about half of the folks are severely cost burdened. It gets better at low income, and it is entirely alleviated if you are in a moderate or above moderate category there. But this is the reason that MidPenn focuses our attention on trying to provide deepest levels of affordability, because it centers our time and flow of subsidies and resources to people who are most impacted at a very personal level. We also support land use reform and policies, procedures that unlock new housing opportunities for everybody, because these issues limit housing choices for everybody, myself included. It seems that nobody is left out of the choices that people have to make, or the choices that people cannot make to accommodate their families, to accommodate growing families, and changes in employment and other important factors that happen as you move through the arc of your life and your career. I'll just leave one final motivator on this topic. Many of you are aware that more than 35,000 residents in the 9-county Bay Area lacked housing or lived outdoors in conditions that are unfit for human habitation. And many more people live paycheck to paycheck at risk of being homelessness. This group that's at risk of being homelessness is, I like to look at it broadly, that there's 900,000 households in the Bay Area that make up the extremely low income group of folks. And many of these we know were deemed essential in the pandemic to our communities as important workers. These folks, if even 0.5% of these folks slip into homelessness, we'll see a 15% increase in our unsheltered brothers and sisters. So including these people in our plans for the future is really the best way for us to have a healthy, safe community that really can envision everybody. So thanks for your attention, for your time considering solutions to this pressing matter. I'm always encouraged to see the thoughtful programs that you put on. Christy, thanks for inviting me tonight.
Thank you, Nevada, and thank you, Belen. I do also want to mention that Nancy McGee from the San Mateo County Schools had planned to join us today, but she's unable to be here because of an emergency meeting. So my colleague Josh Abrams will share some of the points that she's eloquently made in the past.
Yeah, I'll actually just talk about what her predecessor said. And what she said was, there's basically this group of teachers that have been in San Mateo County schools for a really long time, and they were moved here long enough ago that the housing was affordable. And then there's the second group of people who come and go after a couple of years because they see the good prices that the districts pay, but they can't build housing. So, and they said they're dependent on this older group. And when this older group retires, they don't know what's going to happen because the younger teachers just can't live here and they're not willing to make that hour or longer commute. And Christy, if you want to just show that map, what we did a couple of years ago is we mapped where one of the district's employees lived. And what you'll see over time is it started like most of them lived fairly close. And as years and decades have passed, more of them live in the East Bay, in San Jose, or even further, and it's just too hard for them to make the commute in, so they just find new jobs. So I'm sure she would have said it better, but that I want to cover a little bit because it's so important for our future as a county.
Great, thank you, Josh. If you have questions for Belen or Nevada, please put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them at the end. If they're able to answer them and be here, that will be great. And if not, we'll find a way to get some answers shared to participants. So what we wanted to do now was to let you share some of your thoughts with some of the other folks in this group. So we're going to break you into some randomized groups of around 3. The prompt is really to talk about how the high cost of housing has impacted you or someone that you care about. So we're only going to do this for 3 minutes, just a little icebreaker session. So please make sure that everyone in your group is able to speak. And I will put the question in the chat so that everyone will be able to reference it. I think I can launch the breakout rooms. Or Daisy, maybe you need to launch the breakout rooms. Thank you.
And we'll want to close 1 minute early because it'll take a minute to do the breakout rooms. And for people who are just joining us now, everyone is in breakout rooms. They'll be back in just a couple minutes. I guess I'll pause the recording.
Looks like people are back. So thank you for doing that. If you want to share a nugget in the chat about your own housing experience, please feel welcome to do so. The next thing we want to do is very quick, a demographic poll, but I see a question. Ron.
Maybe I think we're saving the questions for the end, right?
Is this a logistical question or is this a content question?
It's just an observation in our group. We were talking about some of the stuff that's been presented is great, but it's sort of, we're sort of talking to the choir here. And we were wondering if we might get maybe peel back a layer of onion and get a little deeper into the topic.
Okay, yeah, that is great to hear. I think this was intended to be able to speak to a range of audiences, because I think we're hoping to reach some people who weren't necessarily the choir already. But I'm glad that you are already part of the choir. And yeah, we'll continue on and hopefully we can get into that. We wanted to do a quick demographic poll. This is a short standard poll that we do for meetings across the county, really to help us understand both who's in the room and as well as who is not. And the goal is just to continually improve our community outreach to make sure that our local governments are hearing from a broad section of the community. So if you can take a minute and check some of these boxes, that would be extremely helpful for all of the jurisdictions in the county. Thank you. I'll wait.
Has someone launched the poll?
Yes.
Okay, I don't see it.
So I'll give you a minute to do that.
Dumb question, but if you are a young person who lives with their parents, how should you answer this question?
We used to have that as a specific call out question, and it made the tally too complicated. Call yourself an owner because your family's an owner. Well, it's a very good question.
I'm sorry, where is the poll?
It should have popped up for you. I'm not sure if you're on a phone how it works, but on a
No,
computer,
I'm on an iPad.
You're on iPad. I would think it should just pop up. Josh, do you know?
Yeah, if it's not working, some versions of Zoom are a little, they're different. So why don't you just chat us your age, whether if you're a rental or an owner, and if your ethnicity. Okay, your ethnicity, if you feel comfortable, just so we know if we're reaching everyone.
Josh, I don't know if you need your slides to start immediately, but if you want to start, we can leave the poll up while you begin your story.
Sure.
Of how a single family home got so expensive.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, sometimes the numbers and the statistics are, it's hard to make sense of it. So I just wanted to talk a little, I kind of do need the slides, but I wanted to talk a little just by tracing an actual house and how it's changed over time. And to protect everyone's privacy, I combined two houses, but it's actually, this is a true story with just combining two houses. And this, I just chose a kind of a typical one from the area. Next slide. Something that actually makes it a little cool. I used to do historic preservation, and this is a home by McKay Homes, which were these big builders in San Mateo and more in Santa Clara County. And they built these great houses that were really affordable to the middle class. And they proudly proclaimed the best for families with children. But actually, McKay Homes it's an interesting story. Look it up if you want. But it's a nice aside. So next slide. So I actually traced it back not to the original owner, but going back to 1975. It was actually the person who bought it that year was a Minnesota farm boy, and he came to California to find his fortunes. He went to UC Berkeley, sorry for Stanford fans, and he became a math teacher, and he bought the home. He on a math teacher's salary. He worked actually in San Mateo County for decades. He retired. He volunteered. He helped new businesses get their accounting in order. But you can see the sales price was $42,500, which in today's dollars is about $200,000. And he needed about $50,000 of income in order to buy it. And that's why a school teacher can do it. And I'm just going to trace it going forward. So next slide. The house sold again in 1990. Oh, a zero got cut off there. The sales price was $235,000, which in today's price is a little under $500,000, and the income needed was about $120,000. Next slide. Oh, it sold in 2013. Sorry, I didn't jump. 2013, and the sales price was $675,000, which in today's dollars is about $800,000. And at this point, you needed to make about $200,000. And most recently, it's not for sale today, but if it were, just looking at the estimates, it would sell for about $1.5 million, and you would need to make almost $400,000. And then if you go to the next slide. I actually just pulled out the income needed to buy this house. And I kind of like to look at it and think, at what point, if I had been born at a certain year, at what point would I no longer have been able to live here? And I think you can all think about that too. Like if you bought your house and if you have children and they can't, well, they were born at the wrong year. And that's why, because housing prices have gotten so expensive. And I don't want this to be a moralizing story, because
Josh, I think we lost you.
to make more affordable homes and to have more housing stock generally. Okay, that's
Josh,
my story.
I think you cut out when you said you don't want this to be a moralizing story. Can you say
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I didn't want anyone to feel bad, because it's not anyone's one choice in an individual's actions that have contributed to it. But I think it's important to understand that there are policies we can put in place that'll help address this, both policies to increase the overall demand, the overall supply, and also to
Okay, I think we will move on now. The next person we have up is Shane Phillips to help us understand how we got here and start to talk about what we can do. So Shane is an urban planner and policy expert based in Los Angeles. He manages the UCLA Lewis Center Housing Initiative and has taught public policy as an instructor at the University of Southern California. And he recently wrote a book about housing policy titled The Affordable City, which is how I know about him. So Shane, thank you for joining us, and you're now up.
Great, thank you. Let me share here really quick, and here we go. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. Obviously, speaking from Southern California, I am not an expert on San Mateo specifically, but I think the challenges San Mateo is facing are very similar to the challenges faced by all of Southern California, all of the Bay Area, many other parts of the country, and the roots of the problem are very similar as well. So I just want to go over some kind of high level data, and a lot of this is going to be pretty high level, and I'm going to bring it back to the housing elements and some policies we can be thinking about. Just to, I think it was Ron who mentioned wanting to go a little bit deeper, and this will inch us toward that a little bit. So as we all know, housing prices in California are very high. And the point of this slide is just that was not always the case. We've always been a little bit more expensive than the rest of the country, but it's really around 70s, 80s that we started kind of ramping up much faster than the rest of the country. And of course, housing prices have increased much faster than median household wages. Median household wages have been essentially static. This is for California specifically. not just San Mateo. And as a result, people are paying a lot more, just a lot generally, of their income on rent. So one of our previous speakers talked about rent burden. The kind of dark gray color here is severe rent burden. So we see that extremely low income households are paying an enormous, 80% of extremely low income households are paying at least 50% of their income on rent. It's close to 50% of very low income households. When you get to low income households, we're talking about between 30% of the income and 50% of income. We're talking, what is this, 65, about 2/3 of population. So it's a very wide ranging problem. And as we all know, a lot of people want to move to California and the Bay Area specifically, but very few homes are being built to accommodate them. And this is kind of an ongoing and steadily worsening problem. If you go back to the 70s here, you can see the state was in many years building 200,000, 250,000 homes a year. And that has kind of fallen over time. We started to ramp it up again in the 2000s. It fell precipitously and has never really recovered. So that's for all of California. If we zoom in, and thank you, Christy, for sharing this resource from the MTC. But if we look at the Bay Area's housing production over roughly the same time period, it also has fallen quite a bit. And if we zoom in even further to San Mateo County, it has fallen almost to nothing. And there's a little bit of a uptick in the last several years, but we're talking about 2,000 units a year in a county of, I think, around 800,000 people or so. And even going back to all of the Bay Area, this is less than 10% of the Bay Area, maybe more like 6 or 7%. I do want to note that, with tech and everything in the area, rising incomes they do play a major role. But a big part of why we are where we are is because incomes went up, great jobs came into the area, but housing didn't. And so all of these people who were making, great incomes needed somewhere to live, and they bid up the price of the existing housing instead of us building homes for them to live in, alongside the people who were already here. So a little text here, and I'll follow this up with some images, but in much of the Bay Area, neighborhoods of detached single-family homes were built. Sorry, let me close something here real quick. We're mostly building detached single-unit homes in the middle of the 20th century, and as more jobs came to the area and more people arrived or wanted to, housing production, as I said, just didn't keep up. In the 60s and 70s, and this is not just true of the Bay Area, but all around the state, a lot of neighborhoods were downzoned, meaning what was allowed to be built on parcels was reduced. And at that time, it was reported very widely that the explicit reasons for these downzonings were to increase and preserve property values. Now we've succeeded so thoroughly, and prices are so sky high that the construction of new homes is opposed because it's too expensive. So we've kind of swung the pendulum back the other way. And this is a really interesting image from an article on BuildZoom using census data, just showing the evolution of housing production in the Bay Area. And what you're looking at basically is from 1940 to several years ago, basically. And the light blue is mostly single family home development. Dark red is 50+ unit developments. And the dark blue are neighborhoods where basically nothing was built during that period. And you can see just the spread over time of these blue areas where most places are off limits to construction. It's clearly not a lack of demand that is causing the lack of production. Prices are incredibly high and a lot of people really want to live here, but we're not allowing those homes to be built. And just as an interesting aside, the fact that the red, the 50+ unit structures, appears to be increasing over time too. This is really a direct consequence of all of those dark blue areas. We've closed off most places to new housing, And the few places that allow it, it's really being concentrated in very large buildings, and the sort of missing middle duplexes, fourplexes, 10-unit buildings, courtyard apartments. We're not really seeing many of those anymore. I can go through a quick history on housing elements. I'm sure this is covered elsewhere, but I think it's useful background. California has had this state mandated housing planning process for more than 40 years. The regional housing needs assessment and the housing elements, that's what they're called. In this process, population growth is forecasted by the state. Housing need allocations are distributed to regional planning agencies and then to the cities. And those cities, each of them must make plans for how that housing is actually going to be accommodated. And historically, this process has just not worked for a whole lot of reasons. Housing targets were far too low relative to demand. A case I like to point out is in my neighborhood, Beverly Hills. I don't actually live in Beverly Hills, but it's very close, and it's right next to UCLA. The last housing element, which is an 8-year process or planning period, they were required to build only 3 homes over an 8-year period in a city of over 30,000 people. And so clearly not a realistic estimate of demand. So they were manipulated by savvy governments, part of this. And even when the goals were more ambitious, if cities failed to meet them, there were really no consequences for that. And so, cut ahead to 2017 and onward, we've passed a lot of laws that have really tried to strengthen the housing element process. We've increased the actual estimates of growth to better match with the demand for living in many of these communities. The state has required cities to create more realistic plans for accommodating housing, identifying sites that are actually likely to be redeveloped into housing. There are fair housing requirements that are, the state is basically telling cities you can't put all of this housing in low-income neighborhoods, as has traditionally been done in many places. And there are accountability measures in place for cities that don't comply with planning mandates or that fail to hit their housing production targets. And so, the question is, how are cities going to hit these targets? They are much higher. In the Bay Area, I know that compared to the previous 8-year cycle, the targets, the housing targets, housing goals are 2 to 3 times larger than they were in the previous cycle. I don't know exactly where San Mateo stands in there, but probably in the same ballpark. So how are we going to meet those? Housing prices and the cost of development are extraordinarily high. So if you want to provide income restricted, low income or moderate income housing, that's going to require really deep subsidies. But at the same time, incomes are also very high. And so many people can afford the price of that new housing. And importantly, the high market rates of that housing, the price of that housing, can help actually cross-subsidize below market, low-income units in the same building. And as I said, the high prices in your region indicate that there is really incredible demand for homes in the region. So if it is legal and straightforward to be able to build them, those homes will get built. But with the price of new housing being what it is, and frankly, existing housing being what it is, and so many people struggling with the price of housing, both old and new, I think the idea that we're just going to build our way out of this in a technical sense, and especially in a political sense, I think is not realistic. And so I want to transition here really quick to kind of the theme of my book, but just kind of my gospel generally, which is that addressing all of these issues is going to take a kind of all of the above approach. So I call these the 3 S's of supply, stability, subsidy. Others refer to them in similar terms like 3 P's of, I think, production, preservation, and something else I always forget, but they're all kind of the same idea. For me, this is about building enough homes to meet all of our needs, protecting renters and other vulnerable households as we do so, and subsidies that will kind of fill the gaps left by the supply and stability policies. And each of these serves a different purpose, and each has to be a priority for a different reason. And as I said, this is a policy statement, but it's also a political one. I just don't think San Mateo or anywhere else being where it is, and with so many people struggling to hold on, it's not going to build the coalitions and the partnerships and the trust needed to solve these challenges if renters and young people and low-income households and communities of color all fear what these changes in this new development might bring. So really quickly, just why each of these matters. Supply for me is about acknowledging that there are physical and economic constraints and realities in the housing market. Housing can't be affordable and accessible if we don't, as a starting point, have enough homes for everyone, and we don't right now. And then scarcity ultimately empowers landlords at the expense of tenants, and it empowers sellers at the expense of buyers. And I like to point out kind of what these different categories of approaches can do. Supply, there's reams of data and research showing that it does stabilize prices by building more housing. And that's really important, but it also creates new resources, taxes, it helps create affordable units. And of course, we all need a home to live in. And so that's a pretty important benefit right there. What supply alone, what just building a lot of housing alone won't do is bring your median home price from $1 million, or in the case of San Mateo, more like $1.5 million, down to 500,000, for example. For a variety of reasons, it's just not realistic that it's going to bring you all the way there. And I think that's just important to acknowledge. On the stability side, if there are physical and economic realities to the housing market, there are also moral obligations that I think we all have. And the reality is that someone shouldn't lose their home simply because they have the bad luck to live in a gentrifying or newly popular neighborhood. Again, for stability, what it can do, what it does do, stability policies like rent stabilization, they shield people from rising rents and eviction. They keep things from getting worse for people, basically. What stability policies really cannot do is solve the underlying drivers of housing prices, which are primarily, though not exclusively, a lack of homes. And they also can't really do a lot for people who don't already have a home, which is a large and growing portion of our population. And then subsidies, these are really just a tool for where supply and stability fall short, which they often will by themselves. They help a lot of people, millions and millions of people with rental assistance and things like that. But they can't help everyone, or they can't solve the problems by themselves that are caused by supply or stability. Just as an example, we're thinking about the Bay Area. You can throw all the money you like at the problem, but if you have more people arriving and more job, incomes keep going up and rents and home values keep going up, just giving people money for rent assistance is just going to cost you more and more every year. So you have to address the underlying issue, even as you try to, do the immediate things to help people where they're at right now. So I feel like I've gone on a long time already, and I have several slides that are more text heavy and that are more about kind of what we do politically and policy wise. I think I'll probably just skip over the policy stuff, but I think politically this stuff is pretty important. And I don't mean this as like an insider politics thing. I just mean this as, how do we all work together? How do we, find agreement on these things? And I think all of these things, these bullet points are important. One thing I always recommend is that cities, counties, invest in representative surveys of your community. Surveys across the state show that majorities of California residents support more housing in their neighborhoods, even if it is more dense than what is currently there. If you go to public meeting, it doesn't always feel that way. And that's because public meetings tend not to be very representative. And so getting that actual representation and figuring out what all of the residents in your community feel is really important. Another one is making the case that growth is not a punishment. It is, or certainly at least can be, an opportunity and an investment in the community. And especially with new state law, cities are just not empowered to stop growth anymore. Given that, they still have the power to shape it to provide the things that residents want. More diverse housing choices, jobs, shops, restaurants, open space, tax revenues generally. All of these things are available, and cities and their residents still have the power to kind of make that take the form that they most desire. I think it's important to consider that the alternative is not just keep things as they are. The alternative is to continue on the trajectory that we are on. Higher prices, more homelessness, more and longer car commutes, increased greenhouse gas emissions, and on and on. And the last point here is just, if you need to blame the state, feel free. The state has mandated a lot of new rules and requirements because local governments have frankly not stepped up, and a lot have not taken the housing crisis and homelessness as seriously as they should. And because of all of these state law changes, yes, cities have to plan for a lot more housing, but they still have the ability to decide exactly where they want to put that housing, what it will look like. Will it all be in one area and very dense? Will it be more spread out? If cities don't comply at all, they lose even the authority to determine that. And so I think it's important to take advantage of the control you have and really determine the future for your community rather than letting that be decided for you. So I'll skip past these and just we can come back to it if we want, but I think this is a quote that I really love. It's from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in a case from 1965. Zoning is a means by which a government body can plan for the future. It may not be used to deny the future, to avoid increased responsibilities and economic burdens, which time and natural growth invariably bring. I hope we can all kind of proceed with that spirit. And I think that's the right way to think about all of this. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Shane. Maybe I'll let you take a breath and we'll take the first question, go back to Belen, which was, if she's ready, do the core agencies have data on community needs since the eviction moratorium ended at the end of September? Data of needs pre and during COVID.
So meaning the core agencies are the 8 agencies for the county, and I do not know what data they might have available post September 30th. So that is still pretty soon, but I can get back to Christy and see if, if I find an answer, you can send it out to the group.
Okay, I can do that. We have lots of questions here. Shane, I guess one I wanted to launch with was, I know you don't work for a city and probably, you don't want to represent that you are from a jurisdictional perspective, but how have you seen ideas like the ones that you ended with folded into housing elements? You're in Southern California, you guys are a little ahead of where the Bay Area is on the process.
Yeah, I definitely want to be clear that I am not on the inside of this. I am actually on the Los Angeles task force for our housing element, and that process has been, in some ways, pretty well done. There's still more to do, but I guess just to answer this on a more technical basis, which is probably the best I can do. Cities, they have their target for how much housing they need to accommodate. And there is a part of the housing element called the sites inventory. And what needs to be done there is the city has to identify every site where development may happen up to the point where they have cleared their threshold. So they'll say, at this parcel, we think 30 homes can be built. At this parcel, we think 12 can. At this one, it's 150. If they have to build 4,000 homes, they have to keep identifying sites until they hit that threshold. And there's a lot of other considerations there in terms of, is this a large enough site or dense enough site to accommodate low-income housing in particular? Are there uses on the site right now that make it unlikely to be redeveloped, in which case you might not be able to use it, or you might have to assign a low probability, which will kind of reduce the effective number of units. But all of which is to say, you have to identify where the stuff is going to go. And if you can't identify enough sites, then you have to commit to a rezoning process where you're actually going to change what can legally be built in some parts of your city to accommodate more growth. And so that's on the supply side. The housing element is ultimately much larger than that, though. And these stability type policies, whether it's rent stabilization or displacement protections of various kinds, even funding approaches like real estate transfer tax or that kind of thing, all of those things can be and are supposed to be included. Although I can't say exactly how binding those things are just being in the housing element. They still have to be kind of followed up by the jurisdiction, whether it's a city, county, whatever.
Great. One question is about the relationship between housing cost inequality and how affordable housing can help wealth inequality. In other words, is it possible for people in affordable housing to gain equity that would help address the wealth inequity they also face?
Is this one for me?
I think it is for you, although it is about subsidized affordable housing, I think. So I could take a stab if you want.
I mean, I can answer it, at least take the first stab. I have very mixed feelings about this generally for various reasons. One is that the white homeownership rate is much higher than the Black or Latino homeownership rate. And so anything we're doing to kind of like prop up home values disproportionately benefits white people to begin with. And regardless of race, if you don't already own a home and you're renting, it's just putting you further behind because rents tend to go up in tandem with home values. There's also issues with how, because of demographics, because of flat out racism and discrimination, because of a lot of reasons, the places where people of color tend to buy do not appreciate in value as quickly. They often buy at a later time in the kind of housing market cycle, such that, this is why we saw, part of why we saw more foreclosures during the Great Recession. So it's a very dicey topic and approach. But I do want to recognize that the reality is, for a lot of people in this country, and disproportionately for people of color, home ownership is, and the home itself is the largest source of wealth, often the only source of wealth. And so it's just, I don't have an easy answer for this other than to say it's complicated. And I've written about alternative approaches in the past. If people want to look up my name and an article I wrote in The Atlantic, they can feel free to do that. But I do think we need to be thinking about different approaches from both traditional homeownership and traditional renting, because I think both of them have some really serious flaws that don't work for a lot of people.
That's fair. There was some interest in the build Zoom data that you showed, and is it accessible so that people can look at cities' neighborhoods in greater detail?
I will share the link in the chat, but they will not be able to zoom in further than what I shared. So you can, oops, just lost the chat. Here we go. So it actually has every metro area in the country, I believe, or all the largest ones. So, what I showed is about what you'll get. You can download some of the data actually that underlies it from that website though. So there's definitely more to pull from there if people are interested.
Great, thank you. And I think maybe we'll close on a question that came up several times, which was how can one, this is not for you, Shane, how can one get access to affordable housing in San Mateo County? Where do you get on a waiting list, that kind of thing? Can I call on one of my Baird and Driscoll colleagues for an answer on this, or?
So the short answer is it's complicated and it's a system that's hard to change. the best way to get on a wait list is both to call your cities and ask them if they keep a wait list, and call nonprofit housing providers like MidPen that's listed here, and ask them if they have any open wait lists. That, and I'll try and get the link. There is a site where you can, where when affordable housing comes up, you can put in a proposal on it. We're trying to get a centralized location where you can look for opportunities. There's obviously much, much, much more demand than there is supply for affordable housing. So I would just say, be persistent, get on every wait list you can, apply each time. Thank you for that's HIPS housing wait list. Get on every wait list you can, apply every time you can. And it's not like winning the lottery. I mean, it's probably in the hundreds, or thousands, but eventually, if you're persistent, you'll hopefully get a unit.
Thanks, Josh. And thank you, Shane. That was a really informative presentation, and I'm sure people will want to there are more questions that we did not get to, but we also want to let everyone get to their evenings. So everyone, we wanted to have one more chance to connect with someone else in the group. So we're going to break you out again and ask you to share something that you learned today that surprised you. So we'll take about 5 minutes for this. So again, please be courteous and make sure everyone has a chance to speak. And I will paste the question into the chat so that you don't forget in the meantime. And then Daisy, can you open up the breakout rooms? Thank you.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
I was put into a breakout room with no one but myself, so I came back.
Oh, so we're
So
still
was I.
recording. I'm alone too here.
Okay, good. So good that we're all here then.
I think this topic is really interesting, the way the prices in California.
To hear. And we're hoping that this, along with the future webinars, will help equip you to participate in your community's housing element process. I also want to note that we are also collecting housing stories and experiences to help put a face to the housing challenges that are facing our communities. So I'm going to paste a couple of resources in the chat now before we close.
And I just posted.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just posted in, someone was asking earlier about how to find affordable housing openings. And I posted in one website that we're trying to get all the service providers in the county to use when they have openings. So feel free to check there. There's not that many on there now, but we hope in the future there'll be more.
Great. So I've included links about where to go if you want to find out more about what's happening in your community regarding housing elements. Let's talk housing.org connect to share your housing story. It's /stories. Our next webinar is on the 27th in 2 weeks, and it will be on housing and racial equity. And we'll be following that with one on housing and climate change. And then the final one will be pulling these all together and how to create desirable communities for everyone. You can sign up at the same Let's Talk Housing site in the events page for all of those. And lastly, your feedback on this event will help inform the future events. So I'm putting one more link in the chat. If you can go there and spend just a couple minutes to share your thoughts on this session and what you'd like to see in future sessions, that would be extremely helpful. I hear that there's a desire, there's a demand for us to go deeper. So if you're already in the choir, tell us more about what you'd like to see. And so I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us. Thanks to our speakers. Thanks to our interpreters. Thanks for all of the questions in the chat and for the participation in the breakout rooms. And we hope to see you on an upcoming Wednesday. Thank you very much.
You lag just a little bit. I'm trying to figure out how to get the chat in a file.
There will be a saved version, and I think we can share that as well. Josh?
You can, yeah, you should see next to the chat, there's 3 dots. There's a smiley face and 3 dots. And if you click on that, it probably gives you the option of saving the chat.
Okay, so where does it go?
It should save it on your computer somewhere.
Oh, Lord.
Okay. If you click on the save chat, it should pop up when we leave the meeting. It should pop up to show you where it is saved.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're not alone. You are not alone.
Oh my Lord.
I'm sorry. Will the slide deck be online somewhere? I believe this was mentioned previously, but it would be great to have access to that.
Yeah, we'll be posting resources on the letstalkhousing.org website. And as long as it's okay with our speakers, we can post slides there as well.
Thank you.
Good night, folks.
Ron, I saw you raise your hand.
No, I was just, I put it in the chat. I just was thinking that housing is just one element. And I would like to see how affordable or low cost housing can be done in a way that also includes appropriate local park space, local transportation, things like that, because that makes up the whole enchilada for a person living somewhere. And so I think those other aspects need to be touched on too. At least I would find it interesting to see how those can be improved as well as housing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think the housing elements get to touch on that, but I think it is a piece of what we'll talk about in the 4th session of the series. And I think, the idea of the 15-minute city very much plays into sort of traditional ideas of community planning and being able to access all the amenities that that one would want to be able to do within an easy distance to reach.
And be sure to bring that up. Be sure to bring that up in your city or jurisdiction housing element meetings if that's on your concern, because that's really where the policy will get written. So, yeah.
If I may add something, I do live in affordable housing, and MidPenn, for the most part, builds all their sites next to public transportation. I live at the Hillsdale area. It is the mecca of transportation. As you know, this is not a food desert. We have plenty of supermarkets. We have the bus and the train. Unfortunately, we have the train because we have other problems, but that's another thing. There's the park, which is a bus ride. There is another park that we can walk to. And then the park on the other side of the train. So for the most part, affordable housing is put in areas that you can not only have access to public transportation, because of course they're trying to decrease smog and all this other things and congestion, but also to other things like food and out the door amenities, all sorts of things.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any closing thoughts before we close the session?
So someone asked about presentations. Christy mentioned that we're collecting presentations And if you want to send those in, right, the plan is actually to get them to decision makers and staff so they can use them. So yeah, please, if you would, tell us your housing story and we'll get it. We'll ask you what your jurisdiction, and we'll get it to the proper people so it can help influence the debate.
And this series is primarily informational. Jurisdictions are participating in it, but they are not officially here necessarily.
If you want to, if you really want to get into the policy discussions, which is really important, watch out for the jurisdiction specific meetings, and you'll have lots of opportunities to give your thoughts about what's important.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm gonna end the
Thank
meeting.
you.